My wildcard is active for game week 30, and in this video, I'm going to be running through all of the best players to pick on a wildcard in each position with the aim of picking my wildcard team. Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey, and in today's video, I'm going to be running through my wildcard draft and all of the best players in each position to have on a wildcard. Now, a quick reminder of where we're at, because I was deliberating whether or not to press the wildcard button a week early, and my video from I think last Thursday is still relevant, weighing up the pros and cons if you wanted a detailed view on whether it's the right time for you to use the wildcard. In my team, it makes more sense, and because of the FA Cup results as well as some injuries along the way, it did make more sense for me to wildcard. Now, the FA Cup results mean that Nottingham Forest, Man City, Crystal Palace and Aston Villa have all progressed into the semi-finals, and their fixtures in game week 34 need moving one way or the other. Now, Nottingham Forest is the odd one out here because they already have a bit of a weird schedule in game week 33 and 35 where they play on the Monday night, meaning that they're more likely to actually keep their game in game week 34, not have a double elsewhere, and just have it in the midweek rather than anywhere else. The other teams, though, will much more likely need their fixture moving, which is why we can kind of paint a bit of a picture of the landscape for the doubles and the blanks for the next few game weeks. Now, game week 32, we already have confirmed Newcastle and Crystal Palace both double on screen now, but with the results in mind over the weekend, we can predict, and we don't know this for sure, so it is worth noting that we don't have complete certainty, but it is likely that Crystal Palace will now have 2 double game weeks back to back. Not the easiest fixtures in there, but still 4 games in 2 weeks isn't too bad. Arsenal will also need their fixture moving, obviously, against Crystal Palace, and that would give them a double game week in 33. The same goes for Villa and Man City, whose fixture against each other will need moving from 34, most likely to game week 33 as well. All of the fixtures are on screen now, and I've included Newcastle there as well, because we already know they have a confirmed double in game week 32. So a lot of our wildcards, if you are on a wildcard this week, will be prioritising players from these teams, but not necessarily only these teams, because we don't want to forget about good players that, even though they don't have double game weeks, still might be FPL relevant. The other thing that has pushed me towards a wildcard this week rather than next week is Erling Haaland going off injured. Now, he left the stadium on crutches at the Vitality over the weekend, came off around 60 minutes. It did help that Marmoush came on and immediately scored as well, but he looked very uncomfortable after what looked like a bit of a nasty fall on the touchline around about the 55th, 56th minute. He struggled on for a few minutes, but you could tell something wasn't right, and then limped off and then was in the boot coming out of the stadium. So it looks very unlikely he's going to be fit for game week 30 against Leicester, a great fixture, of course. Because of that, it meant that my side needed a hit, at least, to get to what looked like an average side for game week 30. And all of the fixtures that I wanted to target for game week 30 are actually with teams that have double game weeks down the line that I would want long term. So Crystal Palace have Southampton this week, Newcastle have Brentford, Man City have Leicester, and all of them have likely double game weeks down the line. With that in mind, it made it much more tempting to hit the wildcard now, because my wildcard this week would probably look very similar to the one that I'd build in future game weeks because of the good looking fixtures for those 3 teams this week. So that, in brief, is why I've hit the wildcard button now, also to gain some price rises this week rather than waiting for next week. But the all-important thing is to look at the players. So let's take it step by step, starting with the goalkeepers, who are my favourites on a wildcard. Okay, so I've narrowed it down to 6 goalkeepers that I'd personally be picking from. There are probably others that you might consider, but I think these will be the most popular picks. Starting with Raya at the top, 5.5. He is the most expensive of the keepers, but I also think that there's good reason for that. The data is exceptional for Arsenal. Under 1 XGC per 90, by far the best out of the serious options on a wild card, and one of the best, if not the best, in the league as well. Good fixtures to come and a double game week in 33, including Fulham, Everton away from home in game week 31, Brentford at home in 32, and then double game week 33 looks likely to include Ipswich and Crystal Palace. So that's not bad at all, and considering the data, I think it's a good way into the Arsenal defence, especially because I think a lot of us would want to double up considering their underlying data. Now, Game Week 34 isn't really an issue for me, and I'll kind of skim over it during this video, but if you don't have a free hit, that is something to worry about, because a lot of these teams that double in Game Week 33 won't play in 34, of course. So because I've got the free hit, I plan on playing it that week. I'm ignoring that game week. But if you don't have a free hit, you need to take that into account. Now, moving down, Henderson is also a very good option, 4.6, and I think pound for pound is probably actually the best of all of these keepers in his own right, but it's not a decision that we make in isolation. We have to pick other Crystal Palace players, or pick from other Crystal Palace players. And I actually think he's my 4th or 5th favourite Crystal Palace pick. So I don't think there's a space for him on my wildcard draft. But the data's not terrible. It's a great price at 4.6 million and good fixtures, including 2 double game weeks. So I think he actually does edge Raya in terms of which keeper I'd pick if it was an unlimited amount of players from each team, but it's not. So I can't really pick Henderson because there are at least 3, if not 4, other Crystal Palace players I prefer. Now, Areola is probably the cheap keeper to be picking up. He's starting for West Ham, 4.2 million, great price point. The XGC per 90 is poor, 1.6, but it's not awful, and importantly, has a good fixture in Game Week 33, and although he doesn't double, Southampton at home is better than a lot of the double game weeks that week. So, for example, Martinez, who is another option on a wild card, I'd be benching most game weeks, barring maybe 32, against Southampton, of course. But then game week 33, it's Newcastle and Man City. And although it's a double game week, I don't honestly expect Villa to necessarily keep a clean sheet. So spending an extra 0.8 million to have Martinez to just play him in 1 or 2 game weeks, especially with those fixtures, I actually back Areola to match him in that week. So I think 4.2 million for Areola makes the most sense for me. You could look at people like Pope or Edison as well. But again, if you're picking Raya as your first goalkeeper, Pope hasn't looked brilliant recently. Dubravka is a threat. And although the fixtures are good and you can run game week 34 through if you don't have a free hit, the data's not amazing. And I think, again, I prefer Raya. Same goes for Edison. Although it's not terrible data, it's not good enough for 5.3 million. And the fixtures are good, but we've had a poor history with Edison, I would say, generally in FPL. He doesn't have much upside as a goalkeeper, doesn't make a ton of saves. And I think considering the data is so far superior for Raya, at only 0.2 million more, he makes the most sense for me. So now over to my overall team. I'm going to pad this out bit by bit, so we don't need to spend long on this section, but I am going to look at having Raya and Areola as a combination. It's a fairly cheap combination when you include Areola. And because I'm bench boosting in game week 33, or at least plan on, I do need 2 playing keepers. So I'm matching up Raya with Areola. Fulham at home for Raya isn't a bad fixture, and he is a much superior goalkeeper. I only plan on playing Areola in that double game week against Southampton on the bench boost. Right then, so on to defenders, and I've created a rather large spreadsheet here because there are a lot of options to consider, but I think 3 stand out in particular. So I want to run through them first. I've starred them all. Gabriel on a wild card just makes all the sense in the world to me. Good fixtures, and as we mentioned with Raya, the underlying defensive data is superb, 0.9 per 90. XGI per 90 isn't bad either for Gabriel. It has taken a bit of a nosedive and he hasn't actually scored in a long time now, but it's still better than the other 2 Arsenal defenders, quite considerably so, and I do think it's worth paying the premium price if you've got the money. 0.04 over the likes of Saliba for XGI per 90. For an extra 0.2 million, I think is fine, and like I said, the fixtures are looking good. Free hit in game week 34. I think jobs are good and on Gabriel. The same can be said for Munoz as well. I actually transferred him in almost 2 weeks ago straight away because I knew I wanted him for that Southampton fixture. The underlying defensive data doesn't look too bad, but it's also improving week on week. They've been very good away from home, and as you can see, Southampton away from home in 30, then you've got 2 away fixtures in the confirmed double in 32, and then another likely double in 33, where they've got Arsenal away in that one. I actually do still really like Palace, even though defensively, those fixtures don't look amazing. Munoz's attacking data, 0.25 XGI per 90. 2/3 of that is goal threat as well. The positions he takes up are phenomenal. For me, he's an absolute lock at his price on a wildcard, and I wouldn't debate it any further, to be honest. After that, Gvardiol is the third one I've starred. He is, again, a bit, not quite an auto pick, but close to. 6 million isn't cheap, and if you are struggling budget-wise, then he might be the one that I would downgrade if you wanted to. But the attacking data is good, 0.24, very close to Munoz, and the defensive data isn't terrible either. The fixtures are also very good. Leicester at home, Man United away, Crystal Palace at home, and then the double game week of Everton and Villa. It's a good little run for City, and although I'm not that keen on Ederson, Gvardiol does have the added upside. It is worth noting, very briefly on Gvardiol, if you were tempted to go against him, I think you could take him on because he actually hasn't had a shot in 5 or 6 game weeks. So although that underlying attacking data is good across the season, it has been regressing. So maybe there's an element of taking him on as a possibility. But for me, because I've got the money and because I do like the fixtures, and I don't really like any other City defenders either, I think Gvardiol makes it into my team. Now, elsewhere, we've spoken about Arsenal. I think you can downgrade Gabriel to Saliba or Timber if you wanted to. But for me, it would only be if I had both of them that would be an issue. So Gabriel alongside a Saliba or alongside a Timber. I'm already doubled up with Raya, so I'm not going to be looking at Saliba or Timber, but that could be a combination you might quite like. A Newcastle defender, I think, is fairly important to have on a wildcard. Of course, good fixtures leading up to Game Week 32, and then Game Week 32 being the double game week. I think it makes a lot of sense, and considering Burn and Livramento are both 4.4 and 4.5 respectively, having one of the two probably does make a lot of sense. You could look at Trippier, who is over $1 million more expensive, and the data's actually not looking that good this season. He hasn't even got an attack and return this year, and he hasn't been starting. He probably has to start because of injuries, but it still doesn't fill me with confidence. And I'm not sure it's enough of an upgrade for an extra $1 million to have Trippier over the likes of Burn or Livramento. Now, with Trippier, you do historically have good attacking data, but it hasn't really been there this season. So for me, I think I would prefer going with Burn or Livramento, and considering that attacking data for Burn is slightly better than Livramento's and he's cheaper, Burn is probably that fourth defender on the wildcard for me. Now, the fifth defender is interesting. We've got a few different options towards the bottom of the spreadsheet here. You've got Villa, you've got Konza and Digne, potentially. You've got Kirkes for Bournemouth, and you've got Wan-Bissaka. Those are probably my 4 favourites for that fifth defender. Wan-Bissaka is tempting, but because I've already got Areola, I'm not sure I want to double up on the West Ham defence for that bench boost in Game Week 33. It's a great fixture, but I would like to maximise my doublers wherever possible. And Kirkes, similar issue. He's got a great fixture this week, but it does regress a little bit in terms of how good the fixtures are. And at 5.2 million, considering the attacking data is good but not exceptional, I think he's a player that I want to take on. And this week, I'd probably be looking at playing a 3-4-3. And I've already got 3 defenders that I really like playing. So Gabriel against Fulham, Munoz against Southampton, and Gvardiol against Leicester. I'm happy with all 3 of them. So Kirkes would be my 4th defender that I'd be playing this week. And after that, I'm not delighted with the fixtures. So I think Kirkes I can take on. And for me, that leaves open a spot for one of the Villa boys. Now, they've got the double game week coming in probably Game Week 33. It's not a great double for defensive returns, of course, Newcastle and Man City, but it's still a ticket in the raffle, right? And at those prices, 4.4 for Konza, 4.5 for Digne, I think it's someone that I'm happy to have on my bench and only play for that double game week. Southampton away in Game Week 32 might be tempting. You could start them in that fixture, but I think because they've got Champions League either side of that fixture, I might even be benching them that week as well. So for me, I'm going to probably go for the cheaper of the 2 options, Konza, even though the attacking data is not great, because I'm just a little bit more convinced in the reliability of starts. Digne has historically been a bit of a troll, so I am a bit concerned that if I brought him in for that 0.1 more, that he'd get a random benching against a Southampton or against one of Newcastle and Man City, and it completely mitigates the benefit of having him for the double game week. So as you can see, we're starting to pad out this wildcard side a little bit. We've got our goalkeepers in situ. I've put in the defenders. Munoz away at Southampton, Gabriel at home to Fulham and Gvardiol at home to Leicester with good fixtures and double game weeks to come for a lot of them. Burn and Konza both on my bench for this week. Konza is more just ahead of the double game week potentially. Burn could be played in most game weeks, but considering the attacking upside's fairly low, I'm happy to just have him sat there and then bring him in for game week 32 especially. So on to the midfielders, and this is where things get really interesting because there are flags, there are different combinations you can use. So this one might take a little bit longer, but we'll start from the top. Mo Salah, for me, is starred and definitely being included on a wild card. I think if Haaland was fit, then it would come into question for some people whether or not to include him. And unfortunately, because of the Haaland injury, it makes a lot of other things much more affordable. And therefore, Salah can be squeezed into most wildcard sides. So you could go without him. He doesn't have a double game week to come in game week 32 or 33 or for the rest of the season. And Liverpool have probably not quite sewn up the league, but you'd imagine at some point over the next 6 or 7 weeks, they will have done, or most likely to, of course, unless they really capitulate. And therefore, maybe minutes are a risk later on down the line. I personally don't think that's the case. The data's amazing, and Salah, considering they're not in any competitions either at the moment, I think will play 90 minutes week in, week out. And the fixtures actually, pound for pound, are still very good. Everton, Fulham, West Ham, Leicester in the 2 double game weeks. Although he doesn't have a double game week, those 2 fixtures are still very good. And then Spurs in game week 34 as well. For me, he's an auto include. He's running at about 10 points a game week, and even without doubles, that's absolutely fine, and it will beat most other midfielders. So for me, he's in and starred, no question about it. After that, things do get interesting. Now, I've included Palmer and Saka here. Palmer is flagged, but he looks likely to be okay for game week 30. Saka is back in training, but I don't think Fulham is going to be the right time to bring him back in from the start. I think he'll probably get brought in more likely between 31 and 32. They're targeting the Real Madrid game in the Champions League for him. So he might get minutes against Everton, but I think much more likely a start against Brentford or possibly even in game week 33 itself. So on a wildcard, I was actually pretty tempted to put in Saka ahead of him being fit, which seems very counterintuitive. But if I played with a Kirkes in my back 4 or have a 4th, 5th midfielder that I like the look of for the next 2 weeks, I could have done it and maybe saved myself a transfer down the line, because come game week 33, I am probably going to want Saka. He's likely to be fit and he's likely to have Ipswich and Crystal Palace. So whatever wildcard I build now, it has to have in mind that I want to get to Saka most likely by game week 33, maybe even by game week 32 as well. So I probably need a placeholder in that position, and I need the money to make that move later on down the line. Now, Palmer could be that placeholder. Although he's flagged, the data is still very good. He's been in terrible form in terms of output, but the data's still been good, and he's had a little break now. And the next 3 fixtures, the 3 fixtures that I'd probably want to wait on Saka for, are actually very good for Palmer. So Spurs at home, Brentford away, Ipswich at home. Those are 3 defences to target. So I don't hate Palmer at all, but he is expensive, and it is a lot of money to put on a midfielder who simply hasn't been getting attacking returns. So it's a bit of a leap of faith on Palmer if I were to go there. The same can be said for Foden, but I am more tempted to go with Foden as it stands. 9.2 million, so a little bit cheaper. The data's not terrible, but it's not as good as the likes of Saka or Palmer. 0.55 XGI per 90 isn't great, but Leicester at home in game week 30. He was brought off early in the FA Cup, so you'd expect him to get that start in game week 30, especially considering KDB, who plays most like him in the team and most likely to be in that number 10 role behind the striker, played good minutes in the FA Cup too, and his legs are getting on a little bit now. So I think Foden is likely to start the Leicester fixture. And then if I can hold on to him for 1 or 2 weeks, Man United, Crystal Palace, he's got a good track record against Man United as well, remember. It is a risk, and he's definitely not solid for minutes, but if I just wanted him for a couple of game weeks and didn't want to rely on him all the way through to the double game week in 33, then perhaps he could be that placeholder for Saka, and I make the switch in either game week 32 or 33. So I don't mind Foden, especially because of the attacking upside for the Leicester game. Gordon is another one that I'm seriously considering. Now, I'll talk about Gordon and Murphy in tandem here, because Murphy's the cheaper option. The data's a bit worse, but it's not terrible. 2.4 million cheaper, and of course he's not suspended for game week 30. So Murphy probably makes the most sense, but looking at my structure on a wild card, I think whichever of these two I pick, I'm likely to bench them in game week 30. So it doesn't actually matter that Gordon's suspended for me. The other thing to monitor is, of course, Gordon came back from the international break with a bit of an injury. So I do need to keep an eye on that. And if Gordon is actually injured and will be a doubt by game week 31, then it's pointless for me including him. But I do have a sneaky feeling that he could be a nice little differential that most of us on a wildcard this week won't pick because he's suspended. And obviously Murphy makes the most sense against Brentford at home. But if you're benching them anyway, and I think a lot of teams will have that player benched, Gordon coming back into game week 31 with Leicester, followed by the double game week of Man United and Crystal Palace, I think that's quite tempting. And although he's a lot more expensive, the data is better, and he is a bit more talismanic than Murphy. He's more likely to get good minutes. I do quite like it. But a word for Murphy, 5 million is a great enabler. He's got decent data for that price, and he's actually started the majority of games this season. So I don't think minutes are a massive risk, or at least not from the start. He might get taken off early a little bit more regularly though, but I think for 5 million you take that. So if I'm struggling for money, I think Murphy from Gordon is an obvious and natural downgrade, and it's not even that much of a downgrade either. But I'm chasing rank, I need to be different somewhere, and having Gordon I think could be that differential for me. So elsewhere in the side, we'll have a look at a few of the cheaper options now. Kluivert for me does make it onto a wild card because he's pretty cheap, 6.1 million. He's on penalties, and the data at 0.60 is very good in terms of XGI per 90. He's probably not a long-term hold, but for the next 2 game weeks against Ipswich at home and West Ham away, I do want some Bournemouth coverage. I haven't gone with Kirkes, and I'm not going with someone like a Semenyo either. So Kluivert for me makes sense to include, considering all of those pros, and then I'll probably look at moving him on for an Aston Villa midfielder around about game week 32-33. So we'll talk about Aston Villa midfielders in a minute, but the next up is probably the Crystal Palace mids. Now, Sarr and Eze are both good picks, but Sarr actually does outstat Eze pretty dramatically by 0.17 XGI per 90. And although to begin with during the season the minutes weren't there, they certainly are now. And at 5.6 million is another fantastic enabler to bring into your side on a wild card. For me, I've starred him. He's an auto pick, considering the price, considering the data, and considering the fixtures. Southampton, and then 2 double game weeks down the line, most likely. For me, it's a very obvious pick, and you could look at doubling up with Sarr and Eze, but I don't think it's really much of a decision between the two. I think Sarr stands out for me, and Eze is a decent pick, but the data's not really been there this season. He's less talismanic than ever because Mateta's taken penalties, and both Hughes and Wharton have started taking some set pieces as well. So Eze isn't getting all of the data and all of the set pieces he used to, and I think for that reason he'd be my 4th favourite Crystal Palace player to include, so I don't think he quite makes it into a wildcard for me. After that, we've talked about Murphy. Let's talk about Savinho very quickly. Could be a nice little differential. He missed out in the FA Cup because his partner was giving birth, so no injury concern there. Could easily come back in against Leicester, although there's always a risk attached to any Man City midfielder. I include Foden in that, by the way, as well. But the data's very good. 0.58 is actually slightly better than Foden's, much cheaper, and has the double game week on the horizon in game week 33. I think it's a risky but upside pick, so if you have a bit of an attitude towards risk, then Savinho could make sense. Now finally, I think it's worth noting Aston Villa also have that double game week to come in 33, most likely, again unconfirmed, and Southampton in 32, but like I mentioned earlier on, because of the Champions League fixtures either side of Southampton, I think rotation will come into play in game week 32, and that reason is why I'm not looking at including either a Rodgers or a Rashford or a Senzio on a wildcard now. I'd prefer to probably bring them in for a transfer, possibly even 2 of them, around about game week 33, when I'm much more confident on who gets the minutes across the double game week. I might be able to bring them in a week early if there's one player in particular that stands out as a must start against Southampton, but I can probably kick that can down the road an extra game week if I want to, and I want to give myself the decision with more information come game week 32 or 33. So with that in mind, I think Cliver is on the wild card for me now, and it's probably a transfer that's penciled in for a couple of game weeks towards an Aston Villa mid. I've used Rodgers here, but it could be Rashford, it could be Asensio. So picking my wildcard midfield, as I've mentioned already, Salah is an absolute auto pick, as is Sarr. So both of them come straight in. Everton at home for Salah is a captainable option as well, will be very popular as a captaincy. And then Sarr away at Southampton, again, a very good fixture, good data, good minutes. So happy with those two. After that, it is a bit more up in the air and you can have some fun with it. But for me, Cliver is that pick for the next 2 or 3 game weeks before I look at an Aston Villa midfielder. Ipswich at home this week. Not a bad little run after that either. So I think for me, he's a fairly reliable pick to include on a wild card. After that, the next 2 positions are up in the air, and you can look at different combinations. At the moment, I've got Foden and Gordon. Now, Gordon could be Murphy. He could be an Aston Villa midfielder as well. But for me, because I'm benching that 5th midfielder anyway this game week, Gordon, because I've got the money, could be a nice placeholder for next week. And I'm only going to do this if we get good news that Gordon is fit and available for game week 31, or we get good news that he's already back in training. If he's not, then I might just go for Murphy for that security, because he did withdraw from international break with an injury, so maybe there is a doubt there. But I think he's a nice little differential to have that others might not, because he is flagged this game week. Foden as well is a risk. Completely understand that. And you could look at having Palmer instead. You could look at maybe Savinho, or again an Aston Villa midfielder. But for me, I think the upside's there. He got taken off early in the FA Cup, and Man City, considering the options they have available, I think he's very likely to start against Leicester. And if he can just start against Leicester, then that's probably okay. Worst comes to worst, I could even bench him in game week 31 if I needed to, because my front 8 looks so strong. It wouldn't be a nightmare if we were to get word that he wasn't going to start against Man United. But I think he starts against Leicester. I think the upside is there, even though he's been in terrible form generally this season. And it is a differential that I might need to go for, because I am chasing rank a little bit. So that's my midfield 5 right now. Hopefully the logic on Gordon and Foden makes sense. But those are the 2 midfielders that I'm least locked in on right now, and it could change to a Palmer, it could change to a Murphy for the 4th and the 5th midfielders. But of course, we still have 48 hours before locking in our team. So right now, it's Foden and Gordon. I think I'm pretty happy with that combination, but maybe there's something missing. So let me know in the comments below whether you think I'm completely crazy for those 2. Right, so wrapping up with forwards, and there are, again, only 6 options that I really want to consider or look at on a wild card. Now, there are others. You could look at Chris Wood, but he is flagged and he could be out for a month, apparently, if rumours are to be believed. João Pedro's a cheap option, but I don't think they quite make it into a top 5 or a top 6 on a wild card right now. So focusing from the top, Erling Haaland, 14.8 million, would be an auto pick for a lot of people, if only he didn't go off injured in the FA Cup. Now, we've talked about it during this video a lot, so I won't dwell on it too much, but the injury doesn't look great. And considering there's only a 2-day gap now between the FA Cup and Leicester, I think it's very unlikely that he plays in that match, and that is one of the better matches in the run. Obviously, the double game week in 33 is going to be another carrot for a Man City player, and Haaland in particular could be a very explosive option come game week 33. So if the injury isn't too serious, he might just miss game week 30 and then be fine for what is a good run after that. So wildcarding this week has that disadvantage in mind, but it could be a more serious injury. He was in a boot coming out of the Vitality Stadium, so I don't think there's any guarantee that he is going to be okay come game week 31, 32, 33. I think if I was to place odds on it right now, I say he probably misses game week 30 and 31 and then maybe back for 32, 33. But that's completely pie in the sky. We don't know anything. And considering the amount of benefit that you can get out of not having Erling Haaland, considering the price point, I think you can get a lot more benefit elsewhere. And even if it gets to game week 33 and I don't have him, I think the amount of points that I've accrued elsewhere through upgrades I can make probably outweighs having him for that one game week alone for the double. But we'll take that when we get to it. For now, I don't think you can include him on a wild card because there's just way too much risk there for the Leicester game and possibly even the Man United game as well. With that in mind, two forwards in particular I have starred as auto picks for me. Isak has been phenomenal all season, great underlying data, and as we know, Newcastle have a great set of fixtures, starting off with Brentford at home, Leicester after that, then the double game week. They're on a Champions League charge. They're not going to be giving him reduced minutes. He's on penalties. He's been sensational. Absolute auto pick for me. After that, Mateta also makes it in as a bit of an auto pick. He is one of my three favoured Crystal Palace options. The data isn't quite as good as Isak's, but that's over the season. Over the last 10 game weeks, he actually comes out on top, not only of all forwards, but of all players in FPL, including over Salah in terms of XGI per 90. The same can be said for the last 8 game weeks and the last 6. So whatever way you cut it, Mateta's form has been sensational. 7.5 million on penalties, should get good minutes, and although he had the ear injury, did come back in, got the friendly, and then got the FA Cup game, in which he didn't play well, I think it's fair to say, but I don't really put that down to the injury. I'm not sure that it was necessarily a problem with movement or anything like that. I just think he had a bit of an off game, and that's absolutely fine. And I wouldn't let an eye test interpretation of 70-odd minutes against Fulham, who are a good defence, by the way, put you off going for Mateta on a wild card when he's got Southampton, which is, again, a cashing in kind of game. You expect a couple of returns in that fixture. And then after that, Brighton, followed by 2 back-to-back double game weeks, most likely. At that price point, again, for me, he's starred and he's an auto pick. Now, that third forward is a little bit more up in the air, but considering Haaland is out, or looks very likely to be out, Marmoush probably comes in that centre-forward role for City and probably gets very good minutes against Leicester, especially considering he didn't start against Bournemouth, got 30 off the bench and scored immediately. I think it would be very harsh to not include him in the starting 11 for Leicester. And again, after that, good fixtures to come, and if Haaland is a doubt for any of these fixtures, Marmoush looks like the auto pick in that Man City starting 11. The data's not great, but the eye test tells a bit of a different story for me, and he actually does look very good on the eye. And I think if Haaland is out, he'll be playing much more as that focal point in the Man City attack, and I like that. For 7.3 million, I think it does make a lot of sense. There's an argument to say he could even be on penalties with Haaland out. It's definitely possible. And again, that Leicester fixture is just so tempting that I would want to attack it. So you can look at like the likes of Evan Nilsson, who's got Ipswich at home this week, but after that, the fixtures probably die down a little bit. And if I've already got Cliver, I don't necessarily want to double up on the Bournemouth attack because I'll probably be transferring them out come game week 32 or 33. So Evan Nilsson, great price, but considering I'm saving a lot of money by not having Haaland anyway, I don't really need to save any more. So he probably is my 4th favourite forward on a wild card. And then Watkins as well. I do really like him, and I was tempted to try and include him as a bit of a differential now, but I think it makes more sense when we get to game week 32, 33, when we can be more secure on his minutes. He could get a rest in that Southampton game, either side of the PSG and the Champions League fixture. And because of that risk, and because of the good fixtures for the other 3 forwards I want to pick, I think for me, he's someone that I can look at bringing in game week 33, probably by downgrading Isak and taking him out ahead of Villa and bringing in Watkins ahead of Newcastle and Man City. Save a little bit of money there come the time as well. So for me, I think that pretty much resolves my 3 forwards on a wild card. Right then, so no surprises in terms of my forward line. You've got Mateta, Marmoush and Isak. I think that will be an incredibly popular front 3 on a wild card. And I'm so sorry if this has ended up being quite a template team, but I tried to be differential. I tried to find different angles. The best I could do was bringing in Foden and Gordon because I think they'll be fairly differential. But a lot of these picks are fairly obvious. And although you can go against them, I think they are significant downgrades if you do. So I'd be a little bit worried going without a Mateta or an Isak or a Salah, for instance. It just doesn't make a lot of sense considering the data, considering the fixtures and the doubles. And unfortunately, maybe we're just at a period in the season where there are some pretty obvious template picks, and going against them just for the sake of it probably doesn't give you much of an edge at all. That being said, there are always opportunities. I've tried to find opportunities in my midfield, and I think by the time you get to game week 32-33, it might start looking a little bit different again when we get to Aston Villa having good fixtures and the double game week potentially. There are a lot of good Aston Villa options, and you can look at cutting that up different ways. Maybe a Rodgers, maybe a Rashford, maybe an Asensio, maybe a Watkins, and that's where our teams probably start to look a little bit more different as well. In the meantime, though, the one way that I'm considering going a bit different on a wild card in game week 30 isn't just in my midfield, it's also potentially with my captaincy. Now, Salah is going to be the most popular captain, that's no question about it, and has Everton at home, so it's a decent fixture. But Everton haven't been bad defensively under Moyes and have had, I think, top 4 data for the league this season in terms of defensive underlying data. Salah's a monster, and he's averaging 10 points a game week, 2 returns a game week most weeks. So going against him would be pretty risky, and I'm not locking in on doing this at the moment. But I don't think I've seen anyone really talking about captaining Mateta or a Crystal Palace option against Southampton. And as a Southampton fan, I can tell you that is a captainable fixture. Their defensive data is 1 XGC per 90 worse than any other team in the league. We're worse at home than we are away because we're a little bit more expansive. And Crystal Palace away from home are better than they are at home as well. So I do think Mateta, although he's coming back from the injury, given he's on penalties and given he came off early in the FA Cup, I think there's an angle there to say, you know what? He could take on Salah considering the fixture. So currently, my armband is on Mateta because I'm chasing rank. I'm 380k. It's not going well. I do need to try and be different somewhere. But I do just wonder whether wildcarding in itself is going to be differential enough to help gain me the rank. And having someone like a Foden or a Gordon over the next few weeks is also potentially going to give me that little edge. And whether or not captaincy is one thing that I just don't want to take on. So I'm considering it. You could look at Marmoush as an option against Leicester. You could look at Isak against Brentford as well, or even Cliver against Ipswich as well. But Salah's going to be the most popular. Mateta, I just have a bit of a feeling on. I'll let you know close to the time. I'll either do another video or I'll post it on my social feeds before locking in the team. But currently, I'm pretty happy with this 15. I'm happy with the 11, and I think captaincy's up in the air, but I'm happy with how this team maps out over the next few game weeks. I don't think I'm making a transfer for 3 weeks, at least on paper. And then when we get to game week 32-33, I'll be looking at probably downgrading Foden, which, although he has a double game week, I still think is the right call. Looking at bringing in Saka, and also looking at bringing in some Aston Villa attacking options like Rodgers, like Rashford, like Asensio, possibly Watkins as well. And then my 3 free transfers come game week 33 will be spent on Villa and on Saka to complete the triple up for Arsenal as well. So that's it. That's my wildcard side. A lot of you will probably have skipped all of the meat in the middle and come to the end, but I do advise go checking out the meat of the video because I run through all of the different options outside of this 15 in each position. It has been a long video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I am sorry if I've blabbered on a little bit too long. But hopefully it's been valuable to you and help you sort out what your preferred options are on a wildcard as well. If it has, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're on a wildcard, let me know which 15 you're picking in the comments below and which differentials are going to help you gain rank towards the end of the season. In the meantime, good luck ahead of game week 30, and especially if you're on a wildcard, massive good luck on getting that draft locked in.